Bem-vindos ao nosso canal YouTube, nesse Falando Nisso, hoje especial, contando com a presença gloriosa de Alenka Zupančič, estudiosa da psicanálise, filósofa, pertencente ao grupo esloveno, né? Junto com Mladen Dolar, com Slavoj Žižek. A Alenka estudou com Alain Badiou, fez a sua tese muito lida e debatida no circuito da filosofia da psicanálise, Ethics of the Real, saiu pela Verso, e agora nós estamos acolhendo as traduções da obra dela, com esse trabalho Por que a Psicanálise, que saiu pela Lava Palavra, traduzido pelo Rodrigo Gonsalves, meu querido aluno de doutorado. Ele está fazendo seu segundo doutorado, ele fez o primeiro doutorado na European Graduate School, onde a Alenka dá aula, e traduziu Por que a Psicanálise. Tem 3 intervenções, onde ela fala sobre ontologia, sobre liberdade, sobre a comédia e o familiar. E também, ao mesmo tempo, temos que comemorar o lançamento de O que é Sexo, um clássico, né? What is Sex? Que agora sai pela Autêntica na nossa coleção Crítica e Clínica, né? Então são 2 trabalhos que abrem as conversações brasileiras, né, sobre a obra da Alenka. A Alenka é uma pensadora aí de primeiro nível, né? Discutiu com John Kopchak no universo da teoria de gênero. É uma pensadora que a gente assim agradece muito, que humildemente vem falar conosco aqui nesse Falando Nisso, né?
Sim.
Rodrigo?
Bem, antes de mais nada, agradecer, né, pela oportunidade de conversar com 2, né, dos meus orientadores ao mesmo tempo. Então, acho que tanto o Christian quanto a Alenka é ótimo poder estar por aqui, e justamente também por agradecer pelo prefácio. Você escreve né, no Por que Psicanálise, né, e que eu tive justamente o prazer de poder traduzir e fazer um pouco dessa introdução do que a escola do pensamento psicanalítico esloveno, né, tem a contribuir em relação aos nossos impasses, né, justamente não só uma contribuição para a psicanálise, mas também como, né, contribuições para a filosofia, para o campo do pensamento e da política, né, estão presentes nessa conversa, né, que ela proporciona. Então é um prazer estar por aqui, e acho que queria mais fazer um pouco dessa introdução agradecendo, né? E, bem, não sei se eu passo para o inglês, viro o botãozinho...
Olha, então, queria comentar isso, né? Quer dizer, lembrando que a Alenka é atualmente pesquisadora do Instituto de Filosofia da Academia Eslovena de Ciências e Artes, né? E que o nosso processo aqui vai funcionar assim: a gente vai escutar a Alenka fazer uma apresentação sobre o livro dela, e depois a gente vai ter, então, perguntas, questões, comentários do Rodrigo e de mim. Só que isso vai acontecer, então, gente, em inglês, tá? Então a gente pede a compreensão de vocês. Esse material depois vai ser submetido a uma tradução, vai para o YouTube com um suporte mais cuidadoso, né, para que todo mundo possa ter acesso. Mas agora nós estamos gravando e nossa conversação vai ser, então, em inglês. Alenka, I will express my gratitude to receive you here and Falando Nisso and talking about it, translation of this small experiment. And we'll appreciate if you talk a bit about your work, and especially and particularly why psychoanalysis.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm really, really happy to be invited to this conversation. I really thank both Rodrigo and Christian for this invitation. It's an honor. And so I hope I will present at least some parts of my work in the way that we can then discuss them further in the conversation. So I prepared something like 20-25 minutes in which I point out some of the points that I like to make and I think that are perhaps important to be made today. So let me just start with this. So first, I think we can all agree that a lot is going on around sex lately. Le sexe bouge, the French would say, and it is also kind of real international movement. From exposing, different layers of sexual harassment and abuse, to affirmative struggle for recognition of multiple sexual gender identities, reshaping our language and social forms of communication, and so on. And I think that psychoanalysis seems to be mostly caught between, on the one hand, kind of more conservative tendencies to resist this movement, to find and point out its faults and misconceptions, or perhaps to reassert its own classical doctrinal claims. And on the other hand, to try simply to keep up with these changes, with the progress, to keep up with the movement, or to adapt and adopt psychoanalytic teaching and practice accordingly. But I think it is kind of safe to say that psychoanalysis is by no means the avant-garde or a key player in this movement. There are certainly various reasons for that, but what I want to stress is that this is very different from the times when Freud developed his theory of sexuality, when he spoke about it in a quite new and surprising ways, and also pointed out how sexuality spoke in surprising ways. So my starting question today is simply this: does psychoanalysis still has something to say in relation to sexuality, something that would be of relevance, philosophical relevance, but also political relevance in this contemporary debate? And if so, in what sense? And I will also briefly try to address some of the perhaps key conceptual issues at stake in what looks like a certain antagonism between psychoanalysis and gender studies in this more cultural sense. So I am not a psychoanalyst, and I read Freud and Lacan from the perspective of the challenge that their theory presents to philosophy. The challenge that takes the form of their own Freud and Lacan's take on ontology. We will be returning to this term. Of course, psychoanalysis is not an ontology, and this is not what I want to make out of it. It puts ontology in question, but it does so on its own terrain, not from the outside. It does so by pursuing the question of what sex or sexuality is, the question about its being. It takes sex as the subject of precisely an ontological inquiry. And this is what differs it radically from any kind of sexology, as well as from simple psychology. So my claim is not simply that sexuality is important and should be taken seriously. The claim that Freudo-Lacanian theory of sexuality, the claim is that Freudo-Lacanian theory of sexuality, in its inherent relation to the unconscious, dislocates and transposes the philosophical question of ontology and its impasse or contradiction in a most interesting way. So I'm not interested in sexuality as a case of local ontology, so to say, but as possibly providing some key conceptual elements for the ontological interrogation as such. And I will talk about this also in relation to negativity a little bit further. But first, I think it's important to make this very simple point and to recognize that the approach of Freud and Lacan, which was undoubtedly oriented by their clinical experience, also made sexuality a philosophical or conceptual question. For example, and as I keep repeating, Freud's main insight was not that everything can be reduced to sexuality or that sex is the hidden answer to all our problems. No, for Freud, sex, sexuality was the problem, the question, not the answer. There is nothing self-evident or automatic about sexuality. This was Freud's discovery. Its being and its functioning are surprising. And even if many of our psychic troubles are related to in some way to sexuality, this does not mean that, I don't know, a good sex will fix them. If so many things are indeed related to sexuality, then we also need to ask the following question. What is it in sexuality itself that allows for even calls for these extensions, for these unexpected relations, these complications? So we say sex and we seem to know what we are talking about, but do we really? This is the Freud question. What was and still is disturbing about the Freudian discussion of sexuality is not simply sexuality itself in its dirty connotations. This kind of resistance, indignant at psychoanalytic obsession with dirty matters, was never the strongest one, this resistance, and it was in most part of the world soon marginalized by the progressive liberalism of morals. Much more disturbing was the thesis concerning the always problematic and precisely ontologically uncertain character of sexuality itself. So to the Victorians screaming, sex is dirty, Freud did not answer something like, no, it is not dirty, it is only natural, but something like, what is this sex that you are talking about? And I guess the main point here is that sex precisely, or the sexual, is not simply some positive entity that we could nicely isolate as such, neatly circumscribe, describe it or define it, but that it only gets constituted in relation to other things, to different things, which does become necessarily part of it. Okay, so if this is how already Freud and then Lacan asked these questions, we could also see that things have changed a lot since then, both inside and outside psychoanalysis. And this kind of ontological interrogation is all but disappeared. It is very rare. And sex, as also John Cobject pointed out, was dismissed as precisely dismissed as the subject of ontological inquiry and reverted instead to being what it was in common parlance, like some kind of secondary characteristic, or when applied to an act, something a bit naughty. And I find it interesting that in recent debates, sex and sexuality are mostly conceived in a way that is perhaps best captured with the terms whatever does it for you, or whatever works for you, with the obligatory proviso as long as it doesn't harm anyone else. In other words, sexuality is simply synonymous here with our individual particular modes of enjoyment and their conditions. And seen from this perspective, we can certainly say that every speaking being has its own sexual identity. Why not? And also many psychoanalysts go in this direction. But I claim that something important is missing in this move. And this something is what both Freud and Lacan discovered as a kind of negative core, the void at the very core of drive sexuality and enjoyment. So in this recent discussion, sexuality is often reduced to its positive manifestations, constituting different identities, also including gender identities, whereas the dynamics, the contradictions, indeed the inherent impossibility resulting in these manifestations is kind of cut off and mostly left unconsidered. And I think this is a problem because this impossibility, these contradictions persist. And they are precisely what makes or can make these kind of struggles also political. For example, what I think is apolitical, the opposite of political, also in the neoliberal version of so-called identity politics, is this idea of the social space as a neutral container of many different positions, which then we or the power should recognize and give, for instance, equal rights to or not. What I think is profoundly apolitical in this perspective on the social as ideally a kind of universal safe space is precisely that it represses and purposefully neutralizes the social and other antagonisms that define and determine the contours of that space itself. There is nothing neutral about this space. True political universality does not come from perceiving the social field as a kind of neutral container of different interests struggling for the recognition. It comes from addressing the antagonisms constitutive of this or that social space, the point of its inbuilt contradiction, negativity. And I claim that this inbuilt negativity informs, deforms, curves this space. It makes it anything but simply neutral. So the question is not only that of equal rights. Obviously, this is also important, but it's not only that, but also of what needs to be excluded for the equality to be perceived as a neutral measure, because usually something falls off here. So, or put another way, when we truly include what has been excluded, constitutively excluded and repressed from a social space, when we include this, we no longer find ourselves in the same social space. We cannot say it's the same, only broader, more inclusive, more tolerant. No, the latter, the social space gets shattered in its foundations and cannot but change in its essence. And this is the political dimension. Otherwise, it just becomes everybody wants to join the same club, which still is, how very much based on certain exclusions, repressions, and so on. So it is in this sense that I claim that the sexual individuation of the social space into just monads of singular enjoyment means or achieves nothing if it does not involve also sexist negativity that allows for and exists as desire, for example, something that circulates here in common. Desire, rather than our modes of enjoyment, is the basis of both, I think, solidarity in some kind of emancipatory universal perspective. So now if we consider this as the question of concept of sexuality, this is why I insist that sex is not reducible to enjoyment simply, nor to this or that signification. I claim that the sexual is inseparable from negativity. What this means is that it is positively structured and positively existing around its own lack of being. So let me try to explain this kind of complicated sounded phrase. The fundamental idea actually is quite simple. You know, sexuality, sexual relations have always been highly socially invested, regulated, part of various symbolic networks and matrices. Obviously not always in the same way, but still. And this sometimes generates this idea that it is the social symbolic regulation that is the primary cause of sex or gender troubles, because it induces normativity, exclusion, repression. Without denying the normative and repressive aspect of the social, psychoanalysis in its Freudian and Lacanian vein, I think, adds two further crucial twists to this perspective in which social is the reason of all our troubles. First thing that it adds is that there is something in sexuality, is inherently problematic, lacking, not whole, and sexuality does not become such simply because of social regulation and repression, which undoubtedly also exists. Moreover, and this is precisely what brings in this kind of interesting twist, social regulation, normativity, and repression themselves feed on this very negativity. They're tearing with it. They try to make it disappear or fully integrate it, translate sexuality into a symbolic structure of, let's say, signification and meaning. All these kind of polarities of female principle and male principle, this is all about producing this kind of say that paradoxically what is primarily repressed about sex is not this or that sexual practice or identity. So even more explicitly put, symbolic structures, language, are themselves not fully symbolically consistent, but include a point of the real, which is the point of their inherent impasse. So, as you know, probably the real in the Lacanian sense is not some other truer reality or synonymous with reality, but it is the point or impasse of its impasse or impossibility. It is precisely in this sense that we could say that sex is real. Not in the sense that it is objectively determinable biologically or anatomically, but in the sense that of the real that keeps returning through all kinds of symbolic renderings and meanings as their own impossibility. And I think a bit simplified, but we could say that the first, after Freud, of course, the first sexual movement in the 60s and 70s considered sexuality to be something like a subversive antisocial substance. It tended to move away from the social or transgress its norms, this movement, and sought the liberation in getting precisely away from the social, rebelling against the social in its more existing outside it. The second sexual movement, which we are seeing lately, I think mostly moves in the almost opposite direction. It targets the social and seeks to liberate sexuality through the social, not by transgressing it or eliminating it or whatever. It tries to eliminate the negativity of the sexual through the social and through meaning, also as captured in socially recognized sexual identities and their multiplicity. In this last perspective, sex is not a substance, this rebellious substance, but the multiplicity of its meanings, simply significations. And although also in this second perspective, the social is the source of evil, let's say oppression, discrimination, and so on, it is also seen as the remedy to oppression and discrimination if we kind of inflect the social in the right way, make or force it speak what it seems to consider unspeakable, or make simply new, more inclusive norms. And I think this is the stance, or this stance is the ground of what is called today gender politics. Now, psychoanalysis, as I see it, I conceive it, does not differ on the general question of the need for emancipation and fight against oppression or discrimination based on sexuality. Obviously not. This is part of the social struggle. But there is nevertheless a conceptual difference here in respect to these two positions that I've just described. It's a conceptual difference which actually involves a different perspective, we could call it like this, on the ontology of the social. But of course, this also has practical or political consequences, this difference. So very simply put, I would say that for Lacanian psychoanalysis, sex is neither a substance, this kind of rebellious, subversive, untamable thing, nor meaning, nor simply multiplicity of its significations. But sex is real, is the real, even, as in the way that I described the real before, not as another reality or some kind of ground reality, but precisely this impasse. So, as I see it, this is why I think the real core of the debate, which I'm not sure how this debate is present, if in this sense, in Brazil, it is certainly present, let's say, in the States, in Europe, and so on, debate between gender studies and psychoanalysis, sometimes more heated, sometimes less, but I would say that the real core of the debate between gender studies and psychoanalysis is not about multiplicity of genders versus binarity of sexuation, although this is very often how it is presented. Psychoanalysts are binary, they kind of stick to this binarism, and gender politics is about multiplicity and so on. I think the real core of the debate between psychoanalysis and this other ontology is about whether sexuality, although it clearly is a product of signification, I mean, I don't think psychoanalysis has any dispute here, although it clearly is a product of signification, it is not reducible to its significations. So the debate is this. That I will repeat, whether sexuality, although it is clearly a product of signification, is reducible to its significations, or does it rather correspond to a real as the impasse, the stumbling block of these very significations? And I repeat again, to say that sex is real in the Lacanian sense is not to say that it is something objectively determinable, biological or anatomical. It is to say that albeit it is indeed socially constructed, it is so precisely because it has no proper social being. Yet this social non-being of sex exists, insists, persists, weighs heavily on the social space, curves it and makes it anything but neutral. So, I'm not sure I will, can I go on for another few minutes, or have I reached the okay, then just so I think, and John Cobject also made this point nicely, it is not heterosexist to say that sex does not budge. That there is, in fact, the opposite may be true, for it is by making it conform to the signifier that you oblige sex to conform to social dictates, to take on social content precisely. And Lacan insisted on the following subtle yet crucial dimension. It is not that meaning reflects the sexual, it makes up for it. For sex never takes place as meaning precisely. And this is what is disturbing or unsettling about it. So my point is obviously not that we should refrain from talking about genders, gender rights, and so on, but that while talking about that, we should never miss from our side the sexual precisely as the name of their inherent impasse or twist. And this brings me to my conclusion and to this question, a famous and famous question of binarism. I don't know, have you noticed how binarism and non-binarism started to function as kind of master signifiers in many of these contemporary debates? They signify everything and nothing, I would say. Their main function is not to mean anything, but to draw a demarcation line, which in itself is kind of binary, between binary and non-binary thinkers, or us and them, and so on. So I don't think that these categories are very helpful, this binary or not, for orientating us in thinking and in politics. But I will tell you now in what sense I am perhaps a binary thinker. And I would formulate this as follows. We can agree that being is multiplicity, including multiplicity of differences. But then there is also, I claim, a difference that makes a difference and shatters the order of being. It's not simply it's a difference that makes a difference. It also produces these differences. And this is what I call a real difference. Again, in the sense of the real explained before. It's not just another more important difference. And this difference that makes a difference is what gets mobilized or needs to get mobilized in all genuine emancipatory struggles, and serves precisely as the ground of solidarity and collective engagement. For solidarity, it's not the same thing as identification, say, identification with victims of this or that oppression. Solidarity is movement, it is engagement that takes place where there is a void that circulates and incites our desire, including our desire to incite, provoke that desire in others. Okay, thank you very much for your patience. I hope this was not too long and that was more or less clear what I wanted to say.
Very, very, very good. Your explanation. Many thanks about that. Rodrigo, do you want to start comments and questions?
Yeah, sure. First of all, thank you so very much for your beautiful lecture. I think that there are crucial points that you are actually developing and bringing concerning sexual and ontology, and the implications from it are quite crucial to thinking nowadays. Your lecture introduces with the problem or the paradoxical element of the sexual, which is already present in Freud, and your Lacanian perspective on it, your Lacanian lenses towards the problem of the sexual in Freud reintroduces it to think about gender identities, the impasses of gender identities nowadays, and how we actually think about it under neoliberalism. And I think that there is something remarkably political in your work, and your lecture makes it quite clear. So I think that I would perhaps just start by coming back to one of your key elements, your key points. Although you didn't brought that up in detail, I know it's actually on your books, which concerns the partial inherent destruction of the drives, right, which is already present in Freud. So you bring back the three essays, the Freud's 1905 three studies on a theory of sexuality, and you bring the element of the partiality of the drives, which introduces how sex cannot be placed or put calmly into a box. It's always a point of excess. Is this out of jointness? Is this element which always surpasses signification, which is already present in Freud? And you reintroduce that through Lacan. So when you bring back Lacan and his development on drives from seminar 11, you are louder. Sorry. Yes. So when you reintroduce the debate on the theory of drives from a Lacanian perspective, and you bring this element of the partial drives, which is already present in Freud, and you bring this excess to address something which lacks in ourselves, making room for a theory of the subject, right? And this is one of the fundamental elements for Lacan himself, right? But there's something quite interesting, at least for me, which is how this defies a naive perspective on a theory of materialism of the biological, or a more empiricist perspective of reality itself, right? So this disjunction between reality and the real, and how you bring back the Lacanian real, always introduces this incompleteness of reality itself, right? And for me, and this is for me a very fundamental question, which is bringing back, you talk about the uncanny on why psychoanalysis. The uncanny is a beautiful, amazing text from Freud from 1919. And in there, he talks about the impossibility of love to occur, right? And I was automatically thinking about that. How can we think about sex under your appreciation, under this discussion, thinking about the uncanny itself, right? Can we think about the uncanny as this possibility of this incompleteness of reality, this impossibility of love, and how can we actually traverse that? Because one of the way out that Lacan suggests for the sexual is through love, right? So can we think about an uncanny which can actually lead the way or lead a pathway towards love? Or is it always going to be this external impossibility, this negativity which prevents love from occurring? So I was just thinking about, can we think of the uncanny in a certain fashion which can reintroduces through this discussion? Because I think it resonates deeply with the inconsistency that of reality itself, the partiality of the drives, the excessiveness of it. So there are many elements which the uncanny itself brings about, the familiar and the unfamiliar, the external and the internal, the certain topology. It's already in there as a beautiful method for us to think about what poses those questions, which are, as you just pointed out, sexual, right? Not by nature, not biologically put in, but those are questions which derive from the impasse of sex, right? So can we derive a certain materialism, a certain approach to reality itself, which is uncanny, not by nature, of course, but uncanny in its core, right? Because I think it definitely resonates with that. And I think that Lacan's objet petit a points us towards a direction, right? But nonetheless, I think it doesn't say it all, especially when we're thinking about love and when we're thinking about the duration of the love event, right? How can we make something out of this discussion that makes love be reintroduced? Or like, how can we think about love and the uncanny in this certain fashion, right? Is it even something that we can think of or not? Can we think about something that is never fully accommodate? Or is it something that we can actually just provoke ourselves to think, to just consider, right? How does that even point it out to? So I think that there is something, of course, I'm not, as you can all see, it's not fully formulated in my mind yet. Yeah, I think there are kind of elements for us to talk about, but I think those are just more provocations that I would have concerning this possibility. Can we think of the uncanny after this discussion of sex and love? This would be it. Thank you for your lecture again, Alenka.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. Yeah, this was, you introduced many topics and different questions and issues. So this is a vast landscape. I will try to navigate it a little bit in my response. So perhaps one thing that I would start with, so as to avoid one possible understanding of what I was saying, and I try to repeat this a lot. What I'm saying is not simply that sex is an impasse, that it is messy, that it is incomplete, that its meaning is incomplete, and so on. What I'm saying is something more paradoxical, namely that sex is the name of the impasse of meaning, of language, of the structures, not that it is itself incomplete and the language can never. So this is a kind of, and I think this is a strong philosophical but also political point, which is different or would be different than that just to make this kind of romantic idea of sexuality as this kind of, everything else but what is symbolically or reality and so on. So no, this is why I insist it is the point of the inherent impossibility of reality, of the social, of language. And it is the name, also the conceptual name of this, as well as precisely the point which is moving around, but the local, the topological point where out of this contradiction, out of this impasse, certain surplus emerges. Surplus enjoyment, surplus, and again, this topology of the edge or something that falls out or is not there, or a hole even, as the very scene or the very topology where the axis then emerges, axis which is not simply something that fills up this void, but it's a kind of supplement. It's not only we cannot fill up simply neatly this void, but something appears which we don't know what to do with. Please, there is a surplus, which is not simply the complementary thing. We ask something and now we get it. We don't get what we asked for, and on top of it, we get something that we haven't even asked for, which for me is also what drives comedy, for instance. And we can then return to this, and what drives love, for instance, because love is not, when you encounter someone, it's not, okay, this is the answer to all your prayers, but it's always a surprise. It's not simply that you get what you've always wanted. No, it surprises you. It really makes you fall for something else. So a new possibility, a new dimension opens up here. So in this sense, I am trying to work with and conceptualize precisely this ontological space, which is not where being as being is itself structured around logically counterintuitive thing, but I think it really follows also from the psychoanalytic conceptions of the unconscious and so on, which is precisely not being nor unbeing, but something third. This is, then you talk about love. So another important point, when we talk about this excessiveness, this negativity, which is just the other side of excess, I really like to emphasize that in Lacanian theory, the lack and the surplus are like two sides of one typological coin. It is not, and very often the lack exists as surplus in the form of surplus. And so it's not that there is very often surplus is the substance, to say, of lack. It's kind of form. And in this sense, what is interesting about this saying that Lacan is very famous for, there is no sexual relation, which also kind of sums up precisely this square circle of sexuality. This does not mean that, okay, there is no relation, so we are just these solitary monads who can only imaginary think they are in love, but in fact everybody is just condemned to her or his own self and so on. No, Lacan's point is that actually the non-relation does not mean that there are no relations, but that this non-relation is the very stuff on which relations are based and out of which they are made. So it's not simply the opposite. It doesn't say like, there are these books, men are from Mars and women are from Venus. So they are so, like two different planets. So there is no relation. No, the point is that this no relation is precisely what all good, let's say, functioning relationships work with and are based on. Not that this is something, so something happens, it could be a contingency, but something happens that makes this, I would put it like this, a non-relationship that lasts, in the sense of you are actually and seriously involved with someone. And so I'm also like jumping between different points of your intervention. This is why I was so interested also in comedy, in writing on comedy, not simply as funny, as opposed to sad or something like this, but because I was really interested in the internal logic of comedy and its temporality, and more particularly about what and how it works with this famous and famous objecti a, the surplus object. Because, and I think, at least this is my reading, that love is a kind of profoundly comic effect or comic sentiment. This is also the point that Lacan makes at some point. Not because we are happy and laughing all the time and it's all, but because it involves a certain dynamics of the way in which the object that we kind of share with the other, which is neither in me nor in him or her, this object kind of, the love is a way of keeping this surplus object in the air as the very link that relates. So it's almost like ping pong. The ball should not fall down, or then becomes some kind of so there is this interesting dynamics in comedy. As I said, I think when we fall in love, when we actually, something happens to us that we haven't expected. Even if we seek to fall in love, if we go, I don't know, on this dating app and try to find a partner, but when we do fall in love, even if this means it's still a surprise, and it's still this kind of shattering surprise. So you don't know exactly if this, I mean, it's good or bad. It definitely throws you out of joint in a certain way, which is not simply comfortable. And which introduces all kinds of risk and further. But then, what is for me is why I say that comedy can be related to love is precisely because I think differently from many other genres, where also of love novels or so on, you have this either you have this kind of temporality. Everything is about how the two meet and how they finally at the end really get together and live happily ever after. So we get nothing of the very labor of love there. It's just then it stops. Or you have the other movement of the of kind of, it starts like beautifully, and then everything, the couple start to disintegrate. And there is the end of the end of love and the anatomy of this end and so on. And I think comedy, including the famous comedy of Remarried, which is it was a subgenre of its own, manages to kind of catch in some way the dynamics. I'm not talking about the stories of this or that particular comedy, but the dynamics of something of this surplus that forms a bond with someone, even if it could be ridiculous over there, but there is a bond that lasts for a while. So yeah, the uncanny, I don't know, I mean, this is a whole different chapter, and you are much more an expert on the question of the uncanny. I mean, your whole dissertation was kind of related to it. So yeah, there is this, you can say, there is this uncanny moment of love when it happens. That there is always something uncanny. But what then prevails is not anxiety, as in the case of uncanny, but something more movable, something that kind of drives you forward more than just fixes you at that point. Whereas uncanny, you have kind of momentary paralysis almost, where something appears that should not be there. And the whole question is how to proceed from there. And in this sense, I do agree it is somewhat like the moment of falling in love, receiving something in the universe which, although it was there the whole time, it never really got to you in the same way. So I don't want to be too long to say.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Guys.
Thank you.
Alenka, thank you. I want to ask you about the precise role of negativity in this ontology. And this, as you said, sexual is a concept, the psychoanalytical concept of the impasse in fundamental ontology. And in fact, you present Rio as sex and as difference. The difference is a kind of figure of negativity. The difference perhaps is ahead or beyond duality, binarity, and so on. But you talk about Rio in a kind of impasse with a being. The being is a second figure in the explanation, and here we have the lack of being, or as you said, the real of the being is something that do not exist. The being is a sign of a kind of a Lacanian figure for the desire, the lack of being, the paraître. And the third figure of explanation is the existence. What we can understand by the concept of existence, since Lacanian theory of sexuation is clearly based on ideas as the women do not exist, the relationship, a sexual relation do not exist. We have a concept of existence working here, traversing this ontological bunch of problems. And in all these figures, we have a kind of a level or an incidence of negativity. Since the Beyonce, as far as we can talk about the lack, we can talk about the unborn, and so on. So how can you precisely connect those concepts? And this question tries to catch lots of questions we received here from our public. For instance, Nat Roll asked, there's something to do with dialectics. There's a contradictory relation between the real and the being. Afterson calls for a non-dualistic ontology, or you are positing yourself in a dualist, a binary ontology, and how this connects with the debate between Alain Badiou, your supervisor, and Barbara Cassin. I think we have another position here. You use a third way of reading things in Lacanian sexuation. Ramon Oliveira asks that how this ontology could reconnect clinical and social work. And Joshua Black asks if we are not going back to dualism, if we put the question around being and not being, and being one less, as you explain in your book. Sorry for lots of questions. I'm trying to compress it around negativity and ontology.
Thank you very much for all these questions, also to the people who asked them. They are real questions, the questions that we should discuss, and also I think that we would need to discuss probably for days, if not weeks, in order to kind of come up with some thoroughly worked up answers. But so what I can say now here, it's first of all, I'm very sorry if what I was getting at or what I was presenting came across as a kind of revival or turning back to some kind of dualism, because I don't know, my move was precisely that there is always a third position, which always there is. If one looks at how this kind of also debates around sexuality are structured today, there is. I really think that the Lacanian position, or the position that I kind of try to articulate with Lacan, is a certain kind, not a third way in a Blairian sense of the third way, but something that precisely works in a way of pointing out how this initial opposition is actually false or already contains its own dialectics. So in this sense, I am also perhaps Hegelian, not only Lacanian, as we in Ljubljana kind of tend to be. But this, so the simple opposition between ontology or no ontology, which kind of defined the modern philosophy in a very important way, that actually most of the modern philosophy was, let's get rid ontology. Ontology is metaphysics, so we should kind of leave it behind if philosophy is to be serious science, let's say, and not just so. And there was this very, very important turn from ontology, and then at some point this got reversed, and we got the whole blast of so-called new ontologies, and speculative realism, and the question of the imperative that we should return to the questions of ontology or being and so on. And I kind of claim that Lacan, the way also he read philosophy, was already before all this reversal and whatever, it's never considered. I mean, although it's metaphysics, but he never simply dismissed these questions as irrelevant or as things of the past, but was rather preoccupied with how actually what was the real reoccurring through these metaphysical and ontological debates, and precisely at the same time keeping them on the table and not at all shying away from them, saying, he says psychoanalysis is not ontology, and I completely subscribe to this. But this is not to say now just forget about all these ontological inquiries and just talk about, I don't know, something else, the logic, the whatever of construction. So because the logic itself is not simply is not so innocent, let's say, ontologically, which already is there in the word itself, as it may seem. So, and to give you just an example of how this dialectics, I think, of impasse as real and of formalization of symbolic works in Lacan, I mean, I developed this in some detail in What is Sex book. But for instance, when Lacan says, and this is related, by the way, to the whole Badiou-Cassin debate, we can come to this later, when Lacan says that actually, if you look at the history of logic, mathematical logics, you can see that it only advances by way of solving its own paradoxes. I mean, there is a certain logic, and then all these paradoxes emerge. And this was the case from the very beginning, Zeno's paradox. So there is a logical structure, and then there are paradoxes. And then there is a new logic, that appears and that kind of answers these paradoxes. And this goes on all the way then to Russell, to those famous catalog of catalogs and the paradoxes of totalization, precisely, which are very important for Lacan and the formulas of situation and so on. So, but what Lacan says is not, okay, logic is just this impossible thing, it's or psychoanalysis does something else. What he says is that for him, the way he advances and also what he thinks, the way he conceives of his mathemes, the famous mathemes, is how to formalize the very impasses of formalization. Okay, this then becomes very, but it is a third thing. It is not, so the...
Então, pessoal, perdemos aqui a conexão com a Alenka, ela deve estar recompondo, né? Enquanto isso, a gente pode ir falando um pouco, né, sobre essas perguntas, a colocação do Rodrigo sobre o Unheimlich, sobre o infamiliar, né, e sobre a eventual acontecimento, né, é uma ideia que a Alenka discute bastante, né, com o Badiou, a noção de acontecimento, o événement, né, e que a gente acabou não entrando aqui muito no debate, mas ele está atravessando toda essa costura, né, entre o real e a problemática da diferença, né? Não sei se ficou claro aí para o pessoal como a ideia de diferença, ela corrompe tanto a lógica da identidade, porque você tem diferentes tipos de diferença, porque a diferença ela mesma não é necessariamente igual a si mesma, e porque, em função disso, a diferença se desdobra num tipo de infinitude, né, que não é exatamente redutível à multiplicidade, né? Então a gente tem um não dual, um não binário, mas que não é porque tem o terceiro, o quarto, o quinto, mas porque tem uma série ordenada, né, que rege a produção do múltiplo, né? Ele não é meramente assim, um diverso sensível. E a gente está aqui discutindo, então, como no Lacan existe um certo jogo entre a noção de real e como crítica da realidade. Acho que o Rodrigo colocou isso muito bem, né? E isso apareceu na fala dela, né? De como essa problemática da ontologia em Lacan, ela não é indiferente à realidade no sentido da ontologia local, como ela usou, né, essa expressão, e também no sentido da ontologia da linguagem, né, do plano da significação, do sentido, né. Quer dizer, achei muito, muito interessante, muito rico essa colocação dela, né, quer dizer, para além do sexual como substância, né, mas para além também do sexual como construção, como significação, como sentido que a gente dá para essas figuras do negativo, né? A iância, ia perguntar para ela, né, se a iância, enquanto o conceito que vem do Kant, né, a Alenka é uma grande estudiosa do kantismo dentro do Lacan, bom, essa noção ela é reportada pelo Lacan ao Kant do trabalho de 1763, se não me engano, sobre para a introdução das grandezas negativas em filosofia, né? E ali o estatuto da iância, né, o estatuto da grandeza negativa que ele demonstra pelo movimento, mas também vamos dizer assim, pelo buraco. Fica como um conceito que assim, entre o transcendental e o empírico, né? Um conceito difícil de você colocar, né, de um lado ou de outro. E eu acho que a repetição da iância, que é uma ideia que ela vai trabalhar bastante nos dois livros que a gente está discutindo, a repetição da iância como repetição do impossível, né? Do que não cessa de não se inscrever, né? Eu acho que a tua pergunta ela pegou um outro lado do assunto, que é assim, uma face do real é o impossível, mas outra face é a contingência, né? Tem um impossível que acontece, né, pela via da contingência, e que justamente o sexo seria assim a figura negativa que liga essas duas modalidades lógicas, né? Mas não sei, eu gostei que ela falou, né, da solidariedade, que não necessariamente passa pela identificação. Né? O que você achou disso?
Não, achei fascinante. Eu acho que na fala dela mostra justamente esse elemento da riqueza política possível para fazer esse tipo de gradação. Né? Eu acho que por vezes a gente fica pensando, né, como lidar, né, com esse potencial entre aquilo que é local, aquilo que é particular, aquilo que é exato. E tem alguma coisa justamente nessa possibilidade de pensar os passos de uma coletividade possível, os elementos daquilo que a gente se agarra, se identifica, né, como que isso se dá. E me parece que quando ela traz esse elemento, eu acho que ela traz uma espécie de engajamento político de possibilidade para essas figuras de negatividade, mas ofertando um movimento de transformação. Não só...
Ela fala claramente, né, na busca de uma política universal, uma verdadeira política, né, que estaria justamente embedded, né, contida na negatividade, expressa pela negatividade. Né. Acho que você tem aí vários elementos muito contemporâneos, né, no debate brasileiro, no debate também aí internacional, que estão aparecendo na fala dela, né?
Me parece até uma inquietação que na verdade vem do Slavoj Žižek, né? Aproveitando que a gente está também, né, dentro dessa discussão
universo eslovena,
né? Que é um pouco justamente daquela provocação que ele faz.
She's back!
Oh, she's back!
She's back to us! Many
I don't know
thanks.
what happened. I started, all of the sudden I realized that everything was frozen and that I was talking à la cantonade.
L'ambiance! The lack interferes here. No, but it was okay. We explain and debate what you was presenting to us, and so if you want to restart from this question around negativity and ontology.
Because I'm not sure at what time exactly I was.
She was talking about
the
mathematical impasses. Mathematical impasses and the conceptualization and the mathemes of Lacan.
Impasses of formalizations.
But not Badiou and Cassin? No, not yet.
Yet.
I just want this. I did say something about it, so I will simply repeat it now. Just that again, there seems to be, this that they are opposed in the way that Badiou emphasizes in Lacan precisely the formalization and what he calls univocity. That at the end, the term is univocity, it can only be univocal. And Cassin, on the other hand, she is very much insisting on equivocity as the main thing through which psychoanalysis works, and so they kind of supposedly make out these two Lacanian versions, which are supposedly again opposite. But my point again is that from strictly Lacanian perspective, this opposition is not tenable actually, because if you look again at what Lacan is saying, also with these impasses of formalization, it's neither that there are only play on words and puns, and we obviously psychoanalysis works with this a lot. All these equivocities that are so central to the discourse of the Inez and so on, what is going on. And it's also not that at the end this should lead to some unique univocity, but I think that he very much is aware that language is precisely both, and that univocity can also come around precisely by means of equivocity. And what I want to, my favorite example here are precisely jokes. Very often with jokes you have this kind of equivocity. You are led on. They say, okay, you think that what is meant is something, and then a surprise comes which kind of completely redistributes the meaning of this equivocity, but the punchline is then univocal. It's not that you end up with 1,000 possible meanings. It's so but it is by means of equivocity. In the book, I have this very nice example. I don't have time, nor I cannot reproduce it now, but about this, how this man who asks the wife for beer before the TV show starts, and the whole setting is such that he keeps nagging her, get me this beer before it starts, get me the beer before it starts, and so on. And then at some point, she's really pissed with him and angry, and throws the beer down and says, okay, here it is, you stupid, lazy, whatever. And he says, okay, it started. So at the moment you thought it was the TV show that was supposed to start, and here you have this kind of, and then I interpret this further in a way that, but I think what happens in psychoanalysis very often is that certain univocity is the result or is produced in the very process or through equivocity. So I don't think that they are simply opposite. Yeah, so negativity, ontology, existence, these are really, really big themes. And I'm not even sure that I have them figured out for myself. But existence and the way Lacan approaches it is as a question of construction. I mean, this is how the formulas also are constructed precisely, or the way in which this functions in Aristotle, for instance. So it is existence can be constructed. Being is something slightly different. And the whole philosophical interrogation wanted to focus precisely on what it called being qua being, and to answer the question, what is being qua being, just being. And here again, Lacan has this side approach to this. Also, when he says that this is the master's discourse, that this being is just ordered to be. Actually, it's ordered to be. There's this expression that it is a being at someone's beck and call, that you made it to be. He also has this point that it is a substantialization of the copula, which is the origin of this interrogation of being qua being. Because if you just say, I am your friend, this I am is just a copula. It's not being. But then one interrogation of being qua being is precisely means to isolate that copula, that what relates me to something else, or and try to figure out what this being is in itself. So here, and this is for me why psychoanalysis is also so interesting for philosophy. I think Lacan has a very interesting way of showing how, yes, we can interrogate being, but the more we interrogate being qua being, the more it becomes precisely inseparable from this real, what I could read, which is not being. It is precisely. So that being qua being is for him, you could say a certain philosophical fiction. Not because it just produces some fantastic work, but because it kind of fails to see or to reflect this real that makes this being, and it is not being, something like this. Okay, these are all complicated things, but I think that this is what I meant at the beginning when I said that it kind of, for me, psychoanalysis displaces philosophical debate, or philosophical ontological debate, in an interesting way. It doesn't simply say, okay, this is of no interest to us, but it's also some kind of the very ontological interrogation changes, this is something that I've started to work with or tackle with this What is Sex book, which was originally the original working title, Sex and Ontology, but then publishers thought this was much too boring and they changed it to What is Sex. And now we said it very well.
Let's have the last question of Rodrigo, and then we can close the live.
I think that, well, my final question would be if you could just talk a little bit more about the political implications, not only thinking about gender studies and psychoanalysis per se, but what can you talk about the implications on the political concerning what would be a response against neoliberalism and the individualization of enjoyment? That if you could just tell us a bit more about those political implications which are contained in your books, I think this would be a very formidable...
and psychoanalysis as a kind of a critics, or how we can connect psychoanalysis and the critical tradition. This is, of course, a kind of $1 million question now. Can I have the answers? What will get us out of this political and economic impasse? Well, yes, obviously, psychoanalysis is a very useful is not even the right term. It is very good precisely at, I think, producing this kind of analysis of the symptoms that we can detect in our social functioning. So not simply criticizing it, but recognize certain formations, certain things as symptoms that need to be taken and analyzed with care, instead of just eliminated, like with medical, this is the big difference between psychoanalysis and some other therapies, or when you are simply given some kind of medication so that symptoms disappear and you think you are okay, but actually the real trouble continues. I mean, you haven't solved really anything, but perhaps made your life a bit easier. So I think one very important political dimension of psychoanalysis is precisely this capacity to be attentive to the also within ideology, not to look at the ideology as simply false consciousness, but precisely to read it more thoroughly and profoundly as the symptom of what does it exactly hide, and what is its material efficiency and so on. I mean, all these things that Slavoj Žižek analyzes very often and most of the time. So to say that something is a symptom and not simply that this or that this is wrong or critical or needs to disappear. Well, the first question is the problem. The first question that we should critically ask is, why is this needed in this society? Not simply, what other purposes does it serve beyond just exploiting people and so on? So what does it prolong? And in this way, you perhaps get much closer to what I call real antagonisms, real problems, real contradictions of a society, than if you just remain of this one level surface where you have everything that is wrong and you try to eliminate it, but without necessarily getting to the, let's say, the structural causes of this problem, the causes that are. So I think for me, psychoanalysis is also a very important articulation or thought of how to think together precisely these two levels. Let's say the level of experience and the structural level that structures this experience, or let's say the so-called subjective violence and objective violence, or structural violence, because they are not the same in some, but they are related. It's not, one is not some kind of transcendental, inaccessible ground of the other. I think one can access through the appearances, through what is there, to this other level, and actually make some. And I think this is basically how psychoanalysis does work as a clinical practice. Obviously, this cannot be
simply transposed to the social and say, okay, so we'll analyze everybody. But something in this general frame of keeping in mind that what appears as problem, as symptom, is related to many, many things, and it has a function there, very not simply that some, also a function in a certain economic system, obviously, not simple that some people are greedy and want to get rich and some are, there is, I mean, I'm simplifying, obviously, but so this for me is very important and cannot be sometimes missing in these other approaches. We just more flatten out. Are you still? We just flatten out the social space and say, okay, as in take it as some kind of a neutral space that we, as in politics, can observe from above and then decide what would be good or bad. Sorry, is that the problem? Is there a problem? Was there a problem?
Yes, a technical problem. Yeah.
Okay.
Solved.
Yeah. So this is, but this is like more general answer to your question. But I also have a more perhaps concrete answer. I do think, and I don't have the time here to explain the reasons, but I do think that our societies, at least in the part of the world that I live in, are turning into what I would call with clinical categories some kind of a generalized perversion. Really, the perversion, like in the clinical sense, that it kind of all these fetishes dissolve. All this je sais bien mais quand même, this kind of functioning that we know everything is out in the open, and you say in advance, oh no, I know that this so, but nothing then changes. You know, there is this kind of very strange way in which also knowledge about enjoyment and enjoyment as such are the common whatever coin, and we do the social bond. I think really encourages this kind of let's say common everyday perversion. I'm not talking about some extremely whatever, this kind of ordinary perversion, as one of my students put it. And I think what's really disappearing here and missing is, and this was not in the book, but I'm really reiterating this and working on this right now, is the dimension of desire and how desire relates to drive and enjoyment, and what is the difference, and what precisely why enjoyment is not and should not be taken as the object to respond to or to satisfy your desire. You know, which is, I think, what precisely we are offered now to this, eternal point of desire. This is not it. This is not it. They say, no, but this is just you. You need to enjoy. This is it. And I think that the mention of desire in this radical sense is kind of disappeared. And I think also politically, I just briefly mentioned this in my first part of my talk, that the desire is precisely something that is very, very important in emancipatory movements and struggles and things like this. And I do see this in some parts of the world, including in what is going on in Iran, but I don't have now time to bring all this in and explain it.
Alenka, thank you very, very much for your time, for your work, for your disposition. I think it was a great moment. I feel your ideas will be very a large impact in Brazilian debates, and we want to see you here for a congress, for a meeting.
Yeah, we'll be honored.
We
are going to work on it. Rodrigo?
Great. No, thank you very much. And I'm sorry if this was a bit confused, but I hope that at least some of my ideas did get across. So thank you very much for
We did our
inviting me.
homework, yeah.
We'll be in touch.
Yeah,
Okay.
we'll be in touch.
Thank you so very much for both of you, and it was a pleasure to be here with both of you. And I hope to see you here in a conference, perhaps, if we manage to do so, and invite you in and to have you here in person. That would be amazing. So, thank you very much, Alenka.
See you later. Bye.
See you. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Agora são nós. Então, tchau.
Tchau.
Tchau.